I think one aspect of the book, which I really appreciated, was your treatment of middle class aspiration and understanding the middle class. And the book argues that most young people are imbued with a hegemonic middle class aspiration. But what I found different was you don't treat it as the aspiration as simply false consciousness or ideological manipulation. Drawing on Gramsci, it seems closer to a lived common sense. Why has this aspiration remained so durable even when its promises keep breaking down?
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't believe in this thing called the middle class. So I think it's worth just bearing that in mind. Like, I think for me, middle class aspiration is an ideology, right? Is something that's out there to be hegemonized, or the system seeks to hegemonize it and make everybody feel like an individual, as I just said, alienated and able and willing to go and secure a idealized middle class lifestyle. And, the specific sort of conjuncture I'm looking at is one in which we have a very young population, again, something that's consistent across much of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, digitalized. So their aspirations are mediated by the fact they all have this gadget, and they all feel like, even though they don't have it, but they sort of can, it's there in their hands almost. It's something that they can potentially experience, or is very close to them in terms of how it reaches them, or how they can aspire to it, or how they can participate in spheres of aspirational living. And it is, of course, part of a wider sort of ideological shift, right? The neoliberal counter-revolution, where, as Thatcher says, there is no society, there are only individuals, everybody gets as much as they work hard, they get to play hard, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, a global phenomenon. It's not just here. You don't have to be middle class. You don't have to actually have a particular kind of life to aspire to it. And I think that's what I'm looking at. And how does that aspiration become universally, in a sense, established and is out there for people to want? And yeah, and I think that for me then also explains when you don't get it, which most people don't. I mean, the American dream continues to be unrealizable for most working class Americans, but it's still very powerful and hegemonic, right? So what does that mean? That means you, in the absence of getting, you're meeting your desires. It's easy for a particularly conservative, reactionary form of politics based on fear mongering, based on some kind of othering, to be sold, right? Why aren't you becoming middle class? Why aren't you able to meet your aspirations? Because this immigrant, or this, Hindu conspirator from neighboring India, or this sort of internal enemy or internal other who is in Pakistan's case, who is against Islam and is against the nation, so on and so forth. I mean, these are old tropes, but this was a reproduction of this old sort of ideological sort of fear mongering for a young, digitally connected, aspiring population, right? So that's basically the story, or the canvas, that I'm seeking to set out. And then who are the actors? What are the names? Which are the parties? In Pakistan's case, there's always one established party, which is the military party, which then manipulates. I mean, the PTI and Imran Khan was the sort of, in a sense, the crystallization of this young, middle class, aspiring population, which, veers between fear and desire. But of course, the PTI since has been kicked out. And so, that population is still there. That population continues to in a sense, to have its politics, its aspirations largely not overdetermined by, but largely shaped by by these hegemonic aspirations. And then, as I said, when you can't meet them, then there's someone to vilify. There's a paper tiger out there. So it's not false consciousness, it's lived. But of course, there's aspects of it where the paper tiger sort of becomes the target of your ire, your anger. And then, as I said, there's a whole separate sort of stories about why do digital mobilizations only go so far in helping us either move beyond the paper tiger or just reproduce new paper tigers again and again.
Yeah, there's like a really Fanonian sort of stream in the book, and Fanon critiques the national bourgeoisie as, something that inherits the privileges of decolonization without transforming the social order beneath it. In your book, when you're talking about middle class aspiration, it also appears through, things like property, education, migration, consumption, and incorporation in the existing order. Is this one of the reasons middle class becomes central to hegemony in Pakistan, because it translates freedom and advance within the same system rather than collective emancipation?
Yeah, again, I mean, like I said, I don't believe in this middle class stuff anyway. I think that the middle class is probably the biggest ideological obfuscation of the modern era, right? Like, what is the bourgeoisie? What was the bourgeois revolution? You know, even on the left, some for a long time, I think we were trained to think, okay, the bourgeoisie has a particular progressive historical role. It ended the ancien regime, right? It ended the rule of the nobility and feudalism, right? And it ushered in democracy, and that's hogwash. The bourgeoisie never did any of that. All of that was done by the working class. The bourgeoisie conceded all democratic freedoms, the work week, minimum wages, franchise, the women's vote. In the West, I'm talking about, where the bourgeoisie is highly idealized. So I think that, and then in the colony, the middle class intellectual, the native intellectual who is supposed to lead the national movement, so there's always been this supposed role of the middle class, right? And how does it actually look like? So that's what I'm saying. For me in this book, it's more of like an ideological category rather than, I'm not trying to empirically establish, is there one? How big is it? What does it look like? I'm sort of dealing with this long standing sort of ideological, this bludgeoning, like, blunt sort of anchor that continues to in a sense weigh us down, which is, okay, there is something out there. And in the case of this young working mass of people in contemporary Pakistan, which of course is unevenly developed across nations and geographies and genders, it does form like some kind of universal ideological sort of category, right? That, oh, everybody can aspire in this way. So I think that, I think even in the Fanonian reading, there are times where the middle class has a historical role and then it deviates from it. When I'm trying to say, well, where is that historical role? Like, why are we wedded to the idea that there is a historical role? And in this day and age, certainly it's quite clear, I mean, because the neoliberal sort of, in a sense, miracle in the non-Western world was situated around this global middle class, right? India has a 300 million strong middle class. China has graduated hundreds of millions of people into the middle class. There's a big mythology about the non-Western middle class, right? And I think that's really, as an ideological claim, trying to sort of contest it and say, well, this is part of the problem in terms of shaping a meaningful emancipatory politics. We have to sort of really be able to confront this, and not just confront it now, but maybe trace its lineages to even, anti-colonialism, and think more deeply about, well, what is this phenomenon that we call the middle class?
Yeah. And in the book, you also look at, contractors, traders, transporters, and brokers, and those sort of figures. And you also challenge this, clean division between the people and power. What does the multiplication of proletarian figures reveal about class formation in Pakistan?
Yeah, that particular segment, which I think is much more usefully understood as what, Michael Kalecki initially and then Barbara Harris White and others have called the intermediate classes. Now, that was an empirical category which reflected how, as capitalism penetrates into a largely agrarian sector, how small town economies, how petty producers, how a service sector develops in which an intermediate class segment emerges, traders, merchants. And that was sort of Green Revolution, the Gulf migrations. That happened. And, going back 30, 40, 50 years, that segment of the population, which is a perhaps, mobility from below story, is certainly not a progressive segment. It's generally been quite a reactionary segment, historically speaking. So, of course, there's a social change story here. And I think what I'm looking at in the more recent book is sort of what happens with neoliberalism and so-called globalization, where that is an earlier story of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the intermediate segments, which represent, clear change in the social order. And now I'm looking at a more globalized digitally connected, young population, which may or may not actually be socially mobile, but it certainly has broader universal aspirations, right? So these are different moments. These are different historical moments. One is an earlier moment in the post-independence, 20, 30 years after formal independence. Then there's another moment post-Cold War into the late, from the late 90s, early 2000s. And these are all historical moments that I think if we sort of think through the longer arc of history and we think again, what is actually this middle class? One is it's not uniform. It differs at different historical moments, different sort of origins, different kinds of political proclivities. So my interest is, again, in this particular book is more about the younger generation of aspiring middle class subjects. It's about a political subject that is being deliberately fermented, and how then I think that subject needs to undergo some kind of self-transformation, Fanonian, Gramscian transformation of self, collective self, not just individual self, if we are going to recover some kind of emancipatory horizon.
Yeah, and you engage critically with Partha Chatterjee's idea of politics of the governed. And just for our audience, while it captures how marginalized populations secure limited gains through negotiation, encroachment, you seem skeptical that these practices themselves can generate transformative politics. What is your critique of Chatterjee here? Do these forms of agency remain trapped within terms of prevailing arrangements, I guess you could say? Or,
Yeah, I mean, I
you
think
know,
that, look, I think that, I mean, one doesn't want to paraphrase Chatterjee's work, and I don't think Chatterjee is making a claim that any of what he calls, the politics of the governed, or what, he's basically used this binary of civil and political society, and how most people in countries like India, his primary focus is India, but that could apply to, again, the informal sort of mass of people in countries like across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, how they negotiate, how they exercise political agency. So I would be surprised. I don't think Chatterjee would say that this is any kind of revolutionary politics, but this is politics, everyday politics. This is the politics of the governed. I don't disagree with the empirics of that story, but obviously in my case, I'm interested in thinking not just about what is, but how do you potentially recover some kind of revolutionary political horizon? So for me, I think there's some oversights in the Chatterjee story, both with regards to the binary nature of civil and political society, legal, illegal, formal, informal. Those sorts of binaries don't work for me. I don't find that useful. So empirically, I might agree with some stuff, but the way in which all of it is theorized, and less so Chatterjee and more the person that then I think has worked with Chatterjee, but who sort of spoke specifically about what he calls, the sort of post-colonial governmentality under post-colonial capitalism. His name was Kalyan Sanyal, and he talked about surplus populations. He talked about how people who are excluded then are brought back into the net of hegemony by giving them some kind of welfare. So that I find a bit overdone. I think a lot of people are just excluded. Right? We started with talking about these squatters in Islamabad. Islamabad is not remote Balochistan or Pakhtunkhwa or some of our most brutalized peripheries. Islamabad, and if 500,000 people are being booted out of their shanties with no alternative, then there is no real welfare sort of corrective mechanism that keeps hegemony, in a sense, reproducing it, I think. So given that, then what are the prospects for thinking about revolutionary politics, about emancipatory politics? Yes, do people accommodate themselves to the system? Do they use patronage networks? Do they show up in and around elections and say, okay, you give us something and we'll give you your vote? Is it transactional? And those sorts of parts of the story, I think I can get my head around what Chatterjee or Sanyal are saying. But the other parts of the story that say this hegemony is very powerful, and I find it very volatile. I find the fact that this so-called global middle class, hundreds of millions of people in India, are now, these are relatively well-to-do, savvy, probably educated people who are thinking cockroach Janta Party, right? Like this is not a stable hegemonic formation. So where are the revolutionary horizons that we can draw that sort of perhaps acknowledge what an everyday form of accommodation looks like, but recognize that everyday form of accommodation is not working for most people, even though they're trying. And then what are you left with? Where do you go from there?
yeah. And I think you mentioned this earlier, but In terms of contemporary hegemony, you've argued that it operates through a dialectic of fear and desire. Desire pulls people towards consumption, mobility, property, and respectability, but while fear produces threats, outsiders, and enemies. How does this interplay or dialectic of fear and desire help us understand the durability of hegemonic order in Pakistan?
Yeah, look, I think some of this is an old lineage, right, of state ideology where, you are a loyal citizen subject and, you potentially are rewarded for your loyalty. And that's then grafted upon a sort of a contemporary era, again, of digitalization, where now it's not just traditional forms of propaganda. Now everybody themselves is a propagandist, right, via their feeds and their posts and their, the sort of, which of course, as a separate problematic for me in terms of organizational politics. How do you create kind of collective discipline when everyone's out there being Plato and Socrates online? But I mean, the fear and desire is an old trope, right? That there is a loyal citizen subject, and if that citizen subject transgresses the established forms of desire that are allowed within the system, then you yourself become something. You are then suddenly banished and become a traitor or seditious yourself, right? And this has happened in Pakistan and in India and in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh with peripheral regions, with political dissidents, with the left, with all sorts of other sort of others, progressive elements of different kinds. And it keeps happening today. And I think it's just happening in a more intense way now because in the digital sphere, we consciously or unconsciously become the propagandist ourselves, right? What better evidence
Yeah,
than when you saw basically a billion young people, mostly in India, but a lot in Pakistan too, basically vilifying each other at the service of their states in May 2025, right? So these are real life realities of how we are producing and reproducing hegemony ourselves. And I think that's basically, there's nothing new about it, but the form, the modality and the scale, the depth, I think are definitely qualitatively sort of more pronounced.